Next up, we have our first keynote speaker. Please welcome Keith Jopling. He works as a consulting director at MIDiA Research. Thank you, Keith, for being here. And a quick reminder to the audience, please don't be shy. If you have any question, don't hesitate on drop them in the Q&A chat box. So Keith, is it true that when MIDiA Research talks, the music industry listens?
I don't know. We'll find out.
I think everyone should. So please, Keith, whenever you're ready, we are ready. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah, in answer to your question, I think the answer is yes, because, you know, as a brand, we do seem to be going places at the moment. You know, we're a growing company. We just made 3 new hires into the business. 2 of them, I'm very pleased to say, have come onto my team within MIDiA, which is the consulting team. So very quickly on MIDiA. In fact, I should probably at this point do a screen share, if that's okay with everyone. If you can, as host, if you can just enable my screen sharing, is that possible?
We're not, yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay, cool. Okay, you should be able to see my screen.
Yeah, we see your screen.
Great, so you can look at my screen, you don't have to look at me, and that's it. I'm much more comfortable already. So just quickly on me and what I do. So I wear 2 hats actually. So I'm the consulting director with MIDiA, and I'll talk about that in a second. And in this, and we do a lot of things, and we're doing more things, not just music. We cover video, sports, and games as well. But I guess the majority of what we do is in music. And I'm going to bring into this presentation some findings that we uncovered, I think, when we were doing some work for some consulting clients, including Adagio, which is a classical streaming service, the BBC, and a Swedish radio, which is in a very interesting position given the dominance of streaming in Sweden. So I'll bring that into the context of this talk. But I also wanted to bring into the talk the fact that I'm also a curator. So for a couple of years, I've been running the Song Sommelier as a curation site. I'm really loving it because it's made me appreciate and remember and think deeply about the art of music. And I feel one of the things we can sometimes, that sometimes happens in the business, particularly on occasions like this, is we talk about all sorts of things and not much about the music itself, which I know hasn't happened today because you've had some great panelists so far. And I want to bring into this talk as well some of the comments made by Hayes, Landy, and Chaz. So I want to bring in curation and storytelling and context into the discovery process here. So I'll go through the topic of the talk in a second. So consulting, I run consulting at MIDiA. So MIDiA is a part subscription business and part consulting business. So we have, I think we've taken on board bigger projects and solving bigger problems within the industry in the last couple of years. And that's what I came on board to solve. Or to help solve, because I came back to the business after being there at the beginning, actually, with Mark Mulligan. And yeah, that falls into 3 brackets. Inward investment into the music industry, very hot at the moment in terms of publishing, the investment in the independent sector and the creator tools sector, which is booming. So with more creators coming on board into the industry and uploading 60,000 tracks a day to streaming services, there's a lot more creator and marketing tools for them to work with. So that's been a really interesting space for us to work in. I also work on a lot of growth strategies with incumbent companies such as labels and big media brands, but also with tech platforms, streaming platforms, and occasionally entrepreneurs and sometimes SMEs as well. So small to medium enterprises with a turnover of up to sort of 30 or 40 million that are doing interesting things in music. We've been working with some of them on growth. And then deeper audience insight strategies, which if you know the brand MIDiA, that won't surprise you that we're very insights led and data driven. But occasionally we dive deeper into solving specific issues such as go-to-market strategies or market entry into a different country where there's different cultures and very different audiences. And then that takes up 4 days a week, by the way, so which leaves me basically 2 days a week. I have 1 day off. I spend a couple of days a week working on my curation project. So the Song Sommelier's playlists, original artwork, and fan memoir, because I used to enjoy music fan letters back in the day, and they seem to have disappeared from the scene. So I wanted to bring that back in some way. And like everybody else, I've kind of evolved into podcasts as well, and just launched a new podcast yesterday called The Art of Longevity, which is doing really well. It's great to see people are enjoying it. And that is a career journey with artists who've been in the industry for 2 or 3 decades and been through the ups and downs and the ins and outs and the mangle of the industry, and somehow come out the other side better for it and still enjoying making music and still enjoying having a fan base. And through that, I've sort of built up this global community of what we call I work with a couple of colleagues on this, discerning listeners, because it's very lean forward. It is about being enthusiastic, being interested in the music and the creative process, which is easily lost from today's music scene, that lack of context, the lack of stories, as we just have access to more and more music, and we use that in the background, and we use it for a particular moment or purpose, and we don't necessarily stop too much to think about where it came from or reflect on it. So it's kind of an antidote to that. So this is it's a deck that was partly put together for the purposes of a couple of radio projects that we did. I'll just talk for a minute about where radio has found itself in 2021, and put the pandemic to one side a little bit, but things are settling down in radio. I think radio is realizing that it's not going to lose its entire audience, but it's having a bit of a reset in terms of its role in the industry and its role in terms of how it entertains audiences. And previously, radio was always very focused on reach. So reaching 90% of the population of Spain or the UK or the US. And I think it's gradually realizing that maybe that's not really such a goal these days, because there are so many other places where you can get and enjoy music. And so that's where I first began to take an interest in the role of programming, curation, context, and presentation. And I actually think it's a really great time for music for a number of reasons. So yeah, the industry's got its issues, and we can maybe do some of that in Q&A, but I'll very much remain positive in terms of this presentation. So this project we did with Adagio a few years ago was all about where classical music is in the space. And classical music is basically a bit of a Cinderella genre. It's been put to the back of the queue when it comes to the audience's ears, and crowded out by the growth of pop and hip hop and Latin and international music that's really blown up on streaming, like K-pop and even country in recent years. And so there was a project that we did as MIDiA, where we really look to say, you know, where is classical? How can it up its presence in the streaming era? And it was very interesting because you look at where classical is at the moment, and you know, Adagio was out there to sort of serve the aficionado. So it was concerned many of the themes that I've talked about already, that you know, if you're a classical fan on streaming services, you do have issues with what you're getting. Maybe it's sound quality, maybe it's finding the right version of the performance of the piece that you're looking for. Maybe it's, if you're interested in, I don't know, you know, 16th century Baroque Italian music, it's very hard to find a hub where you can explore that on streaming services. And so Adagio built its service to serve that segment of aficionado fans. But then at the time, there was some interesting things happening as well. Like in the UK, there was a relaunch of a classical music station called Scala that was very much about how classical has kind of entered our modern life in different ways, and that, you know, we use classical music to relax, to escape from the world, maybe just to have it on in the background as an alternative. And so they have this strapline of classical music for modern life, which is very, very interesting, sort of a very broad, accessible, friendly way to present classical music, almost to you know, all age groups within a population. And then, of course, something like Peaceful Piano, which has really exploded that type of relaxing, mindful, neoclassical scene, and actually created a bigger sector for that market, with, you know, millions of followers for the playlist, and it's become a very sought after asset for classical or neoclassical musicians and pianists to be on that playlist. And it's found a huge audience, even if people maybe don't realize that they're listening to you know, Max Richter or Oliver Arnolds or whoever it might be. And then more recently, something like Bridgerton is also interesting because it's reintroduced classical in a different way. So classical interpretations of modern pop songs or pop classics that have been presented as the soundtrack to a hit show on Netflix. And this is a great environment to be in if you're marketing classical music. You know, no one's owning distribution in the music space. And a key theme of this presentation is that distribution is actually fragmenting more. And to kind of celebrate that, because that's finding its way to different audiences who are interested in different things. You know, leaning back, listening to music in the background, leaning forward, being very interested in the music and almost wanting to be part of it. Long form or short form, visual or purely audio, people want to consume content in different ways. And that's why these services and vessels are cropping up where you can get music to those different audiences in different ways. So if you're Universal Music and you are looking at this landscape for classical, this is a fascinating and brilliant opportunity for you. You know, they have a classical and jazz library, they have Decca Records, an iconic label, they have a vast amount of catalog, and they probably have a relationship with all of these entities in which they can get that music through these entities. If you're a independent classical, neoclassical artist, it may be tougher, but we'll come on to that in a second, because as Andy Edwards was saying in the previous presentation, it's also a very interesting time for independent artists. So I just wanted to sort of throw that up there. It's no accident, actually, or if it is, it's sort of fallen into an overall purpose that these services were launched to serve different audiences. So I haven't put the segmentation on there, but you know, the 2x2 grid just illustrates that. For example, if you are slightly older as an audience, you might be on the left-hand side of the scale. If you're younger, you may be on the right-hand side. if you're more of a kind of laid back background music kind of person, or you're studying or something, it might be on the lower side of this quadrant. If you're much more into lean forward and experiencing the music, diving into it or enjoying it in a context, it's above the line on this presentation. So again, it just demonstrates that services exist to get music to particular types of audiences in different ways. And that's something that if you're a musician or a label or a publisher or a music marketer, I think it's very exciting. It's also quite complex because you have to work your way through it, but it's hugely exciting. Another thing we've been talking about a lot at MIDiA is a further fragmentation of distribution, which is perhaps friendlier to the growth of independent artists. And so, you know, what we've seen in recent years is very much a dominant sort of oligopoly of providers of streaming, which has been incredible at bringing the industry back to growth, incredible at providing music to be more accessible to larger parts of the population. And basically, you know, people who used to spend maybe 20 euros on music in a year are now spending 60 euros on music in a year. That's in much more numbers. That's great. It's really driven that growth for the industry. But it's been very difficult for those independent artists to kind of find their way onto the hot properties on streaming platforms, such as playlists or the radio stations that are on there, or to be on the homepage of any one of these platforms. And what we've seen emerging recently, and we think there's going to be more of it, is micro communities, which are cropping up to serve, again, different audiences and also creators. And this is really interesting to me. So we've had, the pandemic has certainly given them a boost, but we've had a kind of return of to the scene of more traditional music retailers, if you like, with something like Bandcamp, which doesn't do streaming. I think it now has a sort of streaming preview feature, but sells downloads and vinyl and merch. And Bandcamp has grown hugely since the start of the pandemic, but it's also, I think, found favor with lots of independent artists and labels as well, who've realized they can make more money there. So, you know, so I've spoken to many artists who've made thousands of dollars, some tens of thousands of dollars on the Bandcamp no margin days, which is just like one day a month, where they're able to take all of their earnings that come through that platform, and they're finding, well, I'm making a lot more money there than I have been for years on streaming. And that's become a really important impetus for these new channels that are trying to help artists monetize, partly because of the loss of live income, but also partly to give artists some control back over how they communicate to fans, how they grow and continue to have a direct relationship with their fans, what Andy was describing as D2C, but also get different types of content to their fans. So it's very different to stream on Twitch than it is to stream on Apple Music. On Twitch, you're doing 2 or 3 hour sessions that are quite intimate. You may be chatting with fans, you may be playing them demos of songs, you may even be doing live songwriting sessions, you might be doing DJ sets. And again, you're making some decent money through doing that, through things like fan contributions. So different ways of enabling artists to make money, different ways of enabling artists to communicate differently with different content, and also ways to build audiences. And those audiences may be smaller and more focused. So on Bandcamp, you may be selling, 10,000 copies of your vinyl record. On Twitch, you may be doing weekly sessions to 150 people in the audience. With fan circles, you may be basically delivering via your own app to a mailing list of 2,500, 3,000 fans, but you're monetizing much more effectively through those platforms than you might be on streaming. So it's a sort of rebalancing, partly out of necessity for artists to make a living, partly out of necessity for artists to get some control, because there's a frustration that they're always playing to someone else's playbook. How can I actually have my own playbook to build my audience and my career? And also to give consumers different experiences and to know where to look to find them. So there's some really, really interesting dynamics going on in the distribution space. This is also reflecting on a different dynamic in supply. And this was just blogged by my colleague Mark Mulligan the other day, just based on some new work we've been doing. We all know that there's more of a supply of artists out there. Like, people have been picking up guitars and learning to play keyboards or electronic music, laying down tracks, even mastering their own tracks and uploading them onto Spotify. It's like, wow, I'm an artist. It's great for creativity. It might actually be great for a lot of artists to make a living if they can in fact find different ways of being represented in the industry, finding those audiences, using those creative tools. And it's changing the way that we have a supply of music. So there has been, direct artists, basically artists that are not signed to an independent label or a major label. They're working through distributors, perhaps, the TuneCores and CD Babies and the Muses of this world. There's more of them every day. They're uploading one of the 60,000 tracks a day onto Spotify. It's interesting that the industry is kind of evolving to be able to serve that type of creator as well. So in terms of the distribution space fragmenting, one of the things we're also seeing is the supply being, let's say, more democratized and more varied. And that's great, because I think it's enabling lots of creative people who've always wanted to be artists and make music. Maybe they're able to find an audience. So it's, again, another mega trend, if you like. And then to reflect that, just very briefly, a couple of minutes, on a curious case of radio. So we were working with radio clients where we found that, people working in radio were like, their confidence was so low. They were like, oh, our audiences are dwindling. We can't compete with streaming services. Commercial radio, we're kind of making slightly less money each year because the advertisers are kind of turning away and looking at alternatives. And digging deeply into the strategic position of radio in the space was just enlightening for me personally, and I also think for the teams that we worked with in the radio companies. So the problem's obvious. Radio is being squeezed at least twice over. So first of all, by a migration of audiences to streaming, particularly younger audiences, and then actually streaming becoming quite interested in radio's content through getting into podcasts and making radio kind of available on demand in a different format. It's kind of a nightmare scenario if you're a large radio network. That had an impact in accelerating what was happening in radio anyway, which is gradual aging of audiences. So it gave radio that sort of ultimate dilemma that companies hate to face, which is, do I do everything I can to hang on to my core audience, even though it's dwindling or getting smaller because I've got new competitors? Or do I try and do what my competitors do to keep hold of that audience, or to win competitors, or to win consumers back from them? So that was kind of the dilemma that we've been working with radio. For sure, their formats will have to change. So a pretty obvious thing is that the broadcast system that radio plays to, that the live broadcast is kind of very much yesterday's model and not fit for purpose when people want to consume content where they are and when they want to consume it in the way they want to consume it. So there's been a realization that it will move away from broadcast to be more app-based, that radio itself, which kind of invented podcasts in the first place, would come back to that format and recognize it and have podcasts sitting alongside live and programmed radio. And so the format shift is kind of is something that's fairly obvious to to grasp conceptually and is definitely happening in the real world. In terms of the proposition, what's really interesting is, we would often come across this temptation for radio to want to do what streaming does. So, how can we get more data? How can we personalize radio? Maybe everybody gets their own version of a personalized radio station. Maybe that's the way we can grow our audience back. And in fact, in doing that, sort of classic strategic mistakes mean that you're moving away from what you're good at. So it's all about really playing to strengths. So whilst on demand is a necessity, it's not a necessity, probably not wise for radio to become a subscription business. When radio tries to do playlists and discovery, it doesn't quite work as well as it does on streaming services. Where they do personalization, it doesn't quite work as well because they're effectively a community function. So it's about building on those strengths of community, context, curation, and actually programming, and recognizing that you can then add value to this huge utility that's become the availability of music, more varied consumption of artists, and more fans kind of hungry to get more context, closer to that artist in some way, and feel part of a community wanting to share their fandom with other fans. And so radio is is stepping more into that territory. And just a couple of minutes now to summarize where we got to. The opportunities for something like radio is to look at more cross-generational and cross-genre programming. I'll look at a couple of examples coming up in a minute. To put artists front and center, make them curators, and again, help the fans discover more about the personality of that artist, of the music they've been listening to kind of connect with them as a presenter and find out what makes them tick. And so we've seen more radio stations have more guest curators, more artist podcasts, and doing probably a more effective job of having artist curators than streaming services who've tried that in the past and it just doesn't seem to quite work for them. And also in terms of audience, whilst feeling that their audience is a challenge, that they'll be losing an audience that's migrating over to on-demand platforms and doing other things, that actually they can target broader segments by lifestyle and values, not demographics. So radio for years have been getting narrower and narrower in terms of demographics. Like I'll serve females aged 35 to 44 who like 80s pop or whatever, and doing quite well out of that, but not able to grow from that because you're so narrow in terms of the audience that you serve. And that certainly doesn't work if you're a national station like BBC Radio 2 or Swedish Radio P3. To focus on strengths and differentiate from streaming, and to think local and global. So where streaming services have been so powerful in being global, and artists can find themselves an audience in any part of the world, what radio can do is exactly the opposite of that. It's think about local scenes, regional scenes, even cities that they're serving and what's going on there that, again, hasn't necessarily been the focus for global, sort of very, very tech-led streaming services. So I won't go into the business model here. I've got a couple of examples just to share with you before finishing up. Spotify never stops innovating. It's one of the things I really like about Spotify, and they've actually recognized some of this as well. So it had huge success with its curated playlists and then with its personalized playlists, but realized actually the gap that's left is in the multi-genre, lifestyle-based, but also still lean forward. So these are not background playlists, but they have a certain character to them. And they collate artists from different genres, but artists who kind of represent the same sort of mood or feeling. And they develop that through their Lorem and Pollen playlists. And also, of course, on a platform front, they've been very much focused on owning new experiences and platforms such as the car. And then what caught my attention recently was Sonos, you know, effectively a electronics company, you know, great speaker company moving into content at a time when you think, well, content is very crowded. What would you do to carve out a place in content? And they've recognized a lot of the things that I've been talking about in order to do that. So again, more curated radio. So who wouldn't want to tune into a D'Angelo curated station? And they're really thinking that through and presenting and reimagining what radio might be like in an on-demand world, actually without presenters, which is really interesting to me. And I think there's something there. In my own service, just very, very briefly, it's another sort of attempt at doing that. So, I mean, when I spent some time at Sony Music, and I remember sort of saying to the curation teams at Sony that guitar music was coming back. And of course, Sony being a major and being very focused on today's marketing effort, we're like, oh no, you're completely wrong. We're just going to keep on focusing on hip hop, pop, and Latin. And great, they've done very well out of that. But the fact is that guitar music was coming back. You know, there's a grassroots scene of young bands all over Britain, Australia, and in mainland Europe, like Spain and Italy, kind of making post-punk, indie pop, you know, shaking it up a bit, going back to some sort of punk 70s roots, and actually making really, really tuneful music as well, just banging out great songs.